2 minutes, Evelyn Crosswell said, placing a gold watch flat on the table. That's all someone like you will last in here. The room was full of investors, lawyers, and people who had never once questioned their right to be anywhere. Deshaun Carter stood among them in a rain-soaked delivery jacket, boots still wet from the street, looking like everything this world had already decided to forget. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He pulled out a chair and sat down like the room belonged to him too. What Evelyn didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this man had already survived the kind of night that breaks most people for good. And it had nothing to do with money. Over the next several hours, one conversation would cost a billionaire far more than a gold watch. He didn't leave in 2 minutes. He stayed until the early hours of the morning, and nothing in that room would ever be the same. If this is the kind of story that stays with you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one waiting for you here. The rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon and showed no sign of stopping. Deshaun Carter drove with the window cracked just enough to keep the windshield from fogging, over one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the sealed document box sitting in the passenger seat. The address on the delivery slip read, Aurelian Spire, top floor, urgent. He'd done hundreds of runs like this, last-minute packages for people who couldn't be bothered to wait until morning. He wasn't paid to ask what was inside. He was paid to get it there on time. He pulled up to the building just after 8 in the evening. The lobby alone looked like it cost more to maintain per month than he made in a year. The security guard at the front desk took his name, checked a list, handed him a badge, and pointed him toward the elevators without making eye contact. Deshaun had gotten used to that particular kind of invisibility a long time ago. The elevator brought him to the 42nd floor without a problem. It was the trip back down that turned into an issue. A private fundraising event was in progress at Skyglass Meridian Club, and the main elevator bank had been locked to general access until the event concluded. The security guard on the floor told him it would be 30 minutes, maybe 45. There was a service stairwell, but it was blocked on the 38th floor due to a maintenance crew working overnight. Deshaun stood in the corridor with an empty delivery bag slung over his shoulder and rain still damp in his hair, doing the math on whether 45 minutes would push him past the window to pick up Maya from the neighbor's apartment. It would, by at least 20 minutes. He pulled out his phone to call ahead, and that was when one of the club's staff members, a young man in a pressed vest who looked barely old enough to be working this late, stepped out from a side hallway and told him he was welcome to wait in the lounge area near the entrance. It would be warmer, at least. Deshaun thanked him and followed. He did not expect the lounge to open directly into the main gathering space. The room was everything the rest of the building had been hinting at. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the city, low amber lighting, furniture that looked more like sculpture than seating. The people inside wore things that cost more than cars. They held their drinks with the casual ease of people who had never once had to check a price before ordering. Conversations moved in low, assured tones, the kind of voices that expected to be listened to. Deshaun stood at the edge of it all, rain-soaked jacket, scuffed boots, empty delivery bag. He was aware of the shift in the room the moment he stepped in, not a dramatic hush, but something quieter and more pointed. The way certain eyes moved toward him and then away. The way a small group near the far end of the bar exchanged glances. He had felt that kind of attention before. It wasn't curiosity. It was assessment. He found a spot near the wall to wait out of the way. That was when he heard it. A man near the bar, mid-50s, silver-haired, wearing a watch that probably cost more than Deshaun's car and his rent combined, leaned toward the woman beside him and said it just loud enough to carry, "I'll give him 2 minutes before he finds an excuse to leave." A few people around him smiled. One woman covered her amusement with the rim of her glass. The woman sitting at the center of the group did not smile. She simply looked across the room toward Deshaun with an expression that was harder to read, calculating, almost curious. And then she picked up the gold watch from the table in front of her and set it down with a soft, deliberate click. Evelyn Crosswell was not the loudest person in the room. She didn't need to be. She had built Crosswell Arc Systems from a single patent and a borrowed office into one of the most profitable biotech firms on the West Coast, and in doing so, had learned that real power rarely announced itself. It observed. It waited. It let other people fill the silence, and then used everything they revealed against them. She was 41 years old, had been featured on the covers of 3 major financial publications in the past 2 years, and had not taken a vacation in longer than she could honestly remember. The people in this room were her investors, her legal team, her peers, a circle she had spent 2 decades constructing stone by stone because she understood that in the world she had clawed her way into, the circle you kept was the armor you wore. What almost no one in that circle knew was that Evelyn had grown up about 12 miles from where Deshaun Carter currently stood in her eye line. A different neighborhood, a different kind of 12 miles. She had waited in lines she didn't choose to wait in, worn shoes that other kids noticed for the wrong reasons, and carried a specific kind of shame that only comes from being poor in a city that isn't. She had burned through that shame the way some people burn through grief, by refusing to look at it directly until it turned into something else, something useful, something that looked from the outside a lot like confidence. She raised her voice just enough. "I'll make it interesting," Evelyn said. 2 minutes. If he walks out before then on his own, no pressure. Just because he decides this room isn't for him, I'll match tonight's fundraising total from my personal account. The group around her stirred with amusement. Someone said she was serious. Someone else said she was always serious. The silver-haired man laughed and said he'd never turned down a free donation. Deshaun had heard all of it. He wasn't across the room anymore. He was close enough to have heard every word, and the room knew it, and nobody seemed particularly concerned about that. He could leave. That was the clean option. He could step back into the hallway, wait by the elevator bank, let the 45 minutes pass, get back in his car and drive to pick up Maya, and not think about this room again before morning. It wasn't cowardice. It was just the efficient choice. The kind of choice you learn to make when you don't have the luxury of wasting energy on people who were never going to see you clearly anyway. Then he looked to his left. The young staff member who had directed him to the lounge, the same one in the pressed vest, the one who had shown him basic human courtesy in a corridor, was standing near the service entrance with his eyes fixed on the floor and his jaw set tight. Someone in the group had said something to him. Deshaun didn't know what exactly, but he recognized the posture. He had worn it himself in other rooms in other years before he decided he was finished wearing it. He thought about Maya. Specifically, he thought about the question she had asked him once sitting at the kitchen table while he helped her with a worksheet about community helpers. She had asked him what you do when someone tries to make you feel small. He had told her you stand up straight and you stay in the room. You don't fight. You don't beg. You just stay because sometimes staying is the whole argument. He looked back at Evelyn Crosswell and her gold watch and the circle of people waiting to see what he would do. Then he walked to an empty chair, set his delivery bag down beside it, and sat. Not defiantly, not with any kind of performance. He sat down the way a man sits when he has decided he is allowed to be somewhere, and that is the end of the discussion. The room didn't know what to do with that exactly. The laughter had stopped. The silver-haired man turned back to the bar. 2 women near the window resumed their conversation in lower tones. Only Evelyn kept looking at him, the gold watch still in front of her. Her expression shifted into something she hadn't expected to feel tonight. Deshaun met her gaze and kept it. 2 minutes is nothing, he said. His voice was even unhurried, the voice of someone who had long since stopped spending energy on volume. I've sat through longer nights than this one and still had to get up and make breakfast. Evelyn studied him. You know where you are. Top floor of a building I had to badge into, he said. Room full of people who didn't have to badge in at all. Yeah, I know where I am. One of the men near Evelyn exhaled a short laugh, as if he wasn't sure whether to be amused or offended. Evelyn didn't look away from Deshaun. And you're comfortable, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm dry, he said. That's enough for tonight. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no single moment of revelation, no turning point that anyone in the room could have pointed to and named. It was simply that the bet had been made, and the 2 minutes had passed, and Deshaun Carter was still sitting in that chair, and Evelyn Crosswell, who had spent 20 years learning how to read people, was finding that she could not read this one as quickly as she expected. That bothered her more than she wanted to admit. She had met men who stayed in rooms out of stubbornness. She had met men who stayed out of ego, out of anger, out of the particular need to prove something to people whose opinion they claimed not to care about. She knew what all of those looked like because she had felt each of those things herself at various points in her life, and she recognized their signature. Deshaun Carter wasn't staying out of any of those things. He was staying the way a person stays when they have already made their peace with the outcome and simply see no reason to go anywhere. It was a quality Evelyn associated with a very specific kind of person, the kind who had already lost something large enough that a room full of wealthy strangers registered somewhere below inconvenient on their internal scale. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected to have to recalibrate. She picked up the gold watch from the table and slid it back into her jacket pocket without ceremony. The bet was over, technically. He had lasted 2 minutes. He had lasted 10. The fundraising figure would be matched from her personal account as promised, and that would be that. But she didn't ask him to leave, and he didn't offer to go. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread itself out in the rain, bright and indifferent 42 floors below the room, where a billionaire and a delivery driver had just run out of easy categories to put each other in. The night, as it turned out, was only getting started. The group around Evelyn thinned gradually, the way groups do when the entertainment stops being predictable. 2 of the lawyers drifted toward the bar. The silver-haired man found someone else to talk to. A woman in a deep green dress lingered for a few minutes, watching Deshaun with the particular expression of someone trying to decide whether to be offended or intrigued, then chose to leave before she had to commit to either. By the time the room had settled into its later evening rhythm, it was mostly just Evelyn and Deshaun at the table, with the rest of the event continuing its quiet hum around them. Evelyn leaned back in her chair and looked at him the way she looked at term sheets, searching for the clause that changed everything. "Do you actually know what this building is?" she asked. "Not the address, what it is." Deshaun glanced around the room without hurry. "Place where people come to feel certain about themselves," he said. "Hard to feel certain when you're not sure your rent clears on Friday, so they build rooms like this. Rooms that only let in people who already know they belong." Evelyn kept her expression neutral. "And yet here you are." "Here I am," he said without irony. She tried a different angle, the directness she was known for in boardrooms, the kind that made junior associates visibly nervous. "What do you actually do?" she asked. "Not the delivery. What else?" "Electrical? Plumbing when someone needs it? Whatever's legal and pays the same night." He said it the same way he might have said he drove a blue car. No performance, no apology. "I've got a daughter. She eats every day. That requires a certain consistency on my end." One of the remaining guests, a man in his late 40s who had been half listening while scrolling his phone, looked up at that. Something in his expression suggested he had expected the answer to be more complicated or more defeated, and wasn't sure what to do with the fact that it was neither. Evelyn had expected the same thing. She had spent enough time around people who had struggled financially, mostly in boardrooms, mostly in the past tense, mostly as origin stories polished for investor presentations, to know the performance of resilience when she heard it. This wasn't that. Deshaun wasn't performing anything. He was just telling her what his life looked like, and somehow that was harder to sit across from than any performance would have been. "You're not embarrassed," she said. It came out less like an accusation and more like something she was working out for herself. "By what?" he asked. She gestured not unkindly at the room, at the contrast, at the obvious distance between his jacket and the jackets around him. Deshaun considered that for a moment. "I've done embarrassing things," he said. "Coming in out of the rain while I wait for an elevator isn't one of them. The embarrassing thing would have been leaving because someone expected me to." Evelyn had no immediate answer for that. She reached for her glass and found it empty, and a server appeared before she had to decide what to say next. It was somewhere past 10 o'clock when the conversation shifted into something neither of them had planned. Evelyn had been asking questions with the disciplined detachment of someone conducting due diligence, and Deshaun had been answering them with the same unhurried accuracy he brought to everything else. But then she asked what kept him going, not as a challenge, The challenge had left her voice a while ago, just as a genuine question. The kind a person asks when they've run out of ways to frame someone and have to start actually listening instead. Deshawn was quiet for a moment. Not uncertain, just choosing. "My daughter leaves me half of whatever she's eating," he said. "Doesn't matter what it is. She puts it aside before she starts because she's worried I didn't eat. I have to eat my half before she'll finish hers." He looked at his hands briefly, then back up. "She's 7. She figured that out on her own." He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain what that meant to him or construct a lesson out of it. He just let it sit there. And it sat there with the particular weight of something completely true. Evelyn looked at him across the table and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time in a room like this. The sensation of being in the presence of something she hadn't already accounted for. She had her own memories of being 7. They weren't memories she visited voluntarily. The specific texture of waiting in a line you didn't choose, holding a form you didn't understand, wearing shoes that other kids noticed because kids always notice exactly the thing you most need them to miss. She had taken all of that and compressed it into fuel, burned it clean, built a company and a reputation, and a room full of people who would never dream of laughing at her shoes. She had been so thorough about it that she'd forgotten somewhere along the way that the person she'd been trying to protect was still in there. Still 7 years old in a line she hadn't chosen. She hadn't thought about that in years. She was thinking about it now, sitting across from a man in a rain-dried delivery jacket who made sure his daughter ate before he did. She didn't say any of this. She picked up a fresh glass when it arrived and said nothing for a moment, and Deshawn, to his credit, did not fill the silence with anything. The night moved past midnight. At some point after 1 in the morning, Evelyn made the offer. She'd been turning it over for a while, framing it different ways, and finally just said it plainly. She would cover whatever he'd lost in missed delivery runs tonight, plus a reasonable figure on top. He could go. No hard feelings. The elevator was clear now. Deshawn looked at her for a long moment. "You think I'm still here because of the bet?" he said. "Aren't you?" "The bet ended 2 minutes in," he said. "I stayed because there's a kid on that service staff who spent half the night staring at the floor because someone in your group decided he was also part of the entertainment. And I figured if I walked out, they'd take that as confirmation that people like us know our place." He said it without heat, just as a fact he'd observed and acted on accordingly. "I'm not interested in confirming that." Evelyn set her glass down. She did not make the offer again. It was 20 minutes later that the lights in the east wing of the floor dropped out entirely. It happened without drama. A section of the ambient lighting cut the climate system in that wing went quiet, and a low alert tone sounded from somewhere behind the main bar. A staff member appeared looking strained, explaining that the storm had knocked out a secondary circuit and the building's main technician couldn't get up until the service elevator was cleared. The event's audio system was running on the same secondary circuit. If it wasn't resolved in the next 30 minutes, the remainder of the fundraising presentation would have to be scrapped. Deshawn stood up before anyone had finished explaining. "Where's your secondary panel?" he asked the staff member. The young man looked at him uncertainly, then at Evelyn, then back. "Behind the bar. But the building's policy is—" "I'm not going to rebuild it," Deshawn said. "I just need to see whether it's a tripped breaker or a feed issue. 2 different problems, 2 different solutions." Evelyn gave a small nod to the staff member. He led Deshawn behind the bar to the utility panel. What followed took 11 minutes. Deshawn worked quietly without narrating what he was doing or asking for an audience. He identified a tripped GFCI breaker that had cascaded into the secondary circuit, reset the sequence in the correct order, and brought the east wing back online in stages to avoid another surge. When the lights returned and the climate system hummed back to life, the room offered a round of appreciative murmurs. Deshawn came back to the table, sat down, and picked up the conversation from somewhere near where they'd left it. Nobody laughed at his jacket after that. The people who had found the bet amusing were either gone or had rearranged their expressions into something more neutral. The silver-haired man at the bar looked at Deshawn once more before leaving, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself. It was close to 4 in the morning when the event formally ended. The staff had begun clearing glasses. The remaining guests gathered their things with the slow, satisfied movements of people who had stayed to the very end of something. Evelyn sat at the table a few minutes longer than everyone else, which was her habit. She had never liked the rush to exit the performance of having somewhere better to be. Deshaun was checking his phone, one thumb scrolling through a message from his neighbor, confirming that Maya had gone to sleep fine and was asking him to text when he was on his way. He looked up to find Evelyn watching him. "I'll have a car take you," she said. It wasn't charity the way she said it. It was the same practical tone she might use when the most efficient option happened to also be the right one. Deshaun considered it. Outside, the rain was still coming down. He had a 20-minute drive back to Bayview Heights and a neighbor who had been up past her own bedtime on his behalf. "All right," he said. The car was a black sedan, clean and quiet. Evelyn sat in the back with him, which surprised him. He'd assumed she'd meant a service vehicle, something she'd simply arranged. But she got in without explanation and gave the driver Deshaun's address from memory because he'd mentioned the neighborhood earlier, and she had the habit of retaining whatever might eventually be useful. They rode mostly in silence through the wet, empty streets. The city looked different at this hour, stripped of its daytime confidence, a little more honest about its distances. Deshaun watched the neighborhoods change out the window with the unreadable expression of someone who knew every transition by feel. The car stopped in front of a low-rise apartment building in Bayview Heights. The building was older, the kind that had been well-built once and was now simply well-maintained by the people who couldn't afford to leave it. The light above the entrance was on, casting a narrow, yellow pool on the wet sidewalk. Deshaun opened the door, then glanced back at Evelyn. Something in her expression made him stop, not pity in her face. She wasn't built for pity, but a stillness that looked like someone standing at the edge of a door they hadn't expected to find. "Come up a second," he said. It wasn't an invitation born of warmth or strategy. It was the kind of thing a person says when they sense that another person needs to see something, even if neither of them could explain why. Evelyn followed him. The apartment was on the second floor at the end of a corridor lit by a single overhead bulb. Deshaun unlocked the door quietly and pushed it open. The space inside was small, a main room that held a couch, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, and a window that faced the street. It was clean in the way that takes daily effort when you don't have much room to let things slide. On the kitchen table sat a box of cereal that was nearly empty, a stack of folded papers that turned out to be medical billing statements, and a single sheet of notebook paper with uneven handwriting in purple marker. "Daddy, I saved you the last cookie. It's on the counter. Don't forget!" Evelyn stood just inside the doorway and looked at the room. She didn't move further in. She didn't need to. On the wall beside the table, Maya had taped a crayon drawing of a man in a blue jacket holding a toolbox with the words, "My dad fixes everything," written in careful, oversized letters across the top. The crayon lines were slightly outside the edges, the way drawings look when a child is working as hard as they possibly can. That was when the door to the small bedroom opened. Maya stood in the doorway in pajamas printed with small yellow stars, bare feet on the floor, hair loose, blinking against the light. She had been trying to stay awake. She had succeeded. She looked at her father for a moment with the serious, satisfied expression of a child who had made a decision and seen it through. "Did you win the long night?" she asked. Deshaun crouched down to her level right there on the worn floor. "I'm here, aren't I?" he said. She nodded as though that settled it. Then she took his hand and pulled him gently back toward the bedroom. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the apartment, the open door at her back, the narrow room in front of her, the drawing on the wall, the note on the counter, the nearly empty cereal box, and understood with the sudden completeness of something that had been approaching for hours that she was the least wealthy person in this building. Not because of what was missing from the room, because of what was in it. Because a 7-year-old had saved a cookie for her father. Because a man who had worked through the night and been laughed at by people with more money than they would ever need had come home to a child who had drawn him as someone who fixes everything. And he was. He was exactly that. Evelyn had a penthouse 11 miles from here. She had a car service and a personal chef and a portfolio that required its own team to manage. and there was no one in any of those spaces who had left anything on the counter for her. She pulled the apartment door gently closed behind her and stood alone in the corridor for a moment before walking back down to the car. The driver was waiting. The city outside was quiet and wet, and beginning in the far east to show the first pale suggestion of morning. She got in and said nothing for a long time. The car moved through the empty streets, and Evelyn sat with the particular stillness of a person who has just lost an argument they didn't know they were having. The video had been taken on someone's phone from across the room. 41 seconds. Shaky backlit the audio uneven, but clear enough to catch Evelyn setting the gold watch on the table. Clear enough to catch what she said. Clear enough to catch Deshawn in his rain-soaked jacket, sitting down with the quiet deliberateness of a man who had made a decision and was finished making it. By the time Evelyn's assistant forwarded it to her the following morning, it had already been viewed more than 400,000 times. By evening, it was past 2 million. Her communications director called at 7 in the morning with a draft statement ready. Her legal team sent a separate version by 8. Her board chair, Gerald Whitfield, a man who had known her for 12 years and had never once raised his voice in her presence, left a voicemail that was measured in tone and unmistakable in meaning. The story was moving fast, the shareholders were watching, and a visible, credible response needed to happen before the markets opened Monday. Evelyn read both draft statements. They were well written. They were exactly the kind of thing that could be said in public without meaning anything in private. She set her phone face down on her desk and sat with that for a long time. The problem wasn't the optics. The problem was that she knew with the particular clarity that had arrived sometime before dawn, standing in the doorway of an apartment in Bayview Heights, that she had been wrong. Not wrong in a legal sense. Wrong in the way a person is wrong when they use the weight they've accumulated to make someone else feel like they're taking up too much space. She had done that. She had done it in a room full of people who were watching and found it entertaining. And the fact that she hadn't fully intended it didn't change the shape of what it was. A scripted apology wouldn't fix that. It would smooth it over, which was a different thing entirely, and she was tired of smooth. What made it harder was the question of what came after. She had enough self-awareness to know that showing up at Deshawn's door with a check carried its own particular arrogance. The assumption that her guilt was his problem to resolve. That the correct response to having diminished someone was to arrive with enough money to make yourself feel better about it. She had seen that dynamic play out in philanthropy circles for years. The careful choreography of wealth performing conscience. She was not going to do it here. She needed to think about what it actually meant to make something right, as opposed to what it looked like. It took her 4 days. She found Deshawn through the delivery service's dispatch records and left a message with a straightforward ask she would like to meet at a time and place of his choosing, with nothing on the table except a conversation. No cameras, no press, no prepared remarks. He called back the following evening. They met at a diner in Bayview Heights, the kind of place with laminate tables and coffee that arrived in a ceramic mug before you asked. Deshawn was already there when Evelyn arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a glass of water and no particular expression. He had come from a job. There was a smudge of joint compound on his forearm that he hadn't fully gotten off. He didn't apologize for it. Evelyn sat across from him and didn't open with the statement she had rehearsed because the moment she sat down, she understood that rehearsed was the wrong register entirely. "I was wrong," she said. "The bet was wrong. Using you as a test of something in front of people who were already looking for a reason to dismiss you, that was wrong. I knew it before you sat down, and I did it anyway because I'd gotten comfortable treating that room like a game I was always going to win." Deshawn looked at her across the table and didn't rush to fill the space with acceptance or absolution. "You're not the first person to do something like that," he said. "You probably won't be the last." He turned his water glass once on the table. "But you're the first one who's ever shown up afterward. So, I'm here." Evelyn understood that this was not forgiveness. It was something more careful than that. A door left open a specific amount, not more. She respected it more than she would have respected easy forgiveness. "I don't want to hand you something," she said. "I've been trying to figure out the difference between helping and just relocating the power dynamic, and I'm not sure I've fully worked it out." But I have an idea, and I want to hear what you actually think of it, not what you think I want to hear. Deshawn said nothing, which she had come to understand meant he was listening. She laid it out plainly. A program structured, funded, accountable, built specifically for single parents working night shifts, safe overnight childcare, legal assistance for medical debt, vocational training in skilled trades with direct pathways to stable employment. Not a charity gala, not a foundation with her name on the building, a functioning operation with a board, a budget, and people in the room who understood from the inside what the problem actually was. She wanted to call it Carter Nightlight Initiative. Deshawn was quiet for a moment after she finished. Outside the diner window, a bus pulled up to the corner stop, and two women in nursing scrubs got off, moving quickly through the cold toward wherever they were going next. "I'll ask you something," he said, "and I need an honest answer." Evelyn nodded. "Is my name on it because you feel bad, or because you actually think I should be the one making decisions? Because I watched you fix a circuit problem that 3 people with building access couldn't solve," she said. "Because you spent 4 hours in a room designed to make you feel like you didn't belong, and never once let it change how you carried yourself. Because every person this program is supposed to serve lives the way you live, and none of my people know what that actually looks like." She held his gaze. "I don't need a face for a campaign. I need someone who'll tell me when I'm building the wrong thing." He looked at her for a long moment. "If I'm in, I'm not decorative," he said. "I know. I mean it specifically. If I think a decision is wrong, I say so, and it gets reconsidered. Not managed. Reconsidered. Yes. And the people we hire for the direct services, they come from the communities we're serving. Not imported. Not assigned." "Agreed," he nodded once slowly. It wasn't enthusiasm. It was the measured agreement of a person who had learned to be careful about what they signed on to, and had decided this was worth the risk. "Then let's figure out what it actually needs to be," he said. The next several months were not simple. Evelyn had built a company before, but she had built it with people who spoke her language and operated in her world. Working with Deshawn meant consistently confronting the gap between what sounded right in a conference room and what worked in a neighborhood where people were making decisions under pressure she hadn't personally felt in 2 decades. He pushed back on the childcare model twice before they landed on a structure that made practical sense for parents working variable overnight shifts. He flagged a legal aid partnership that looked good on paper, but had a history of prioritizing billable hours over actual outcomes. He vetoed a proposed location for the first center because the building's management company had a documented record of selective enforcement against black tenants, a detail that hadn't appeared in any of the due diligence materials Evelyn's team had prepared. Each time she listened, not performatively. She listened because he was consistently right, and being consistently right was the only credential she had ever actually respected. Deshawn, for his part, learned things he hadn't known how to learn before. The architecture of a nonprofit operating structure. How to read a program budget with enough literacy to catch the places where money quietly disappeared into overhead. How to sit in a room with funders and say what the program needed without softening it into something more comfortable. He had always known how to stay in a room. Now he was learning how to run one. The first Carter Nightlight Initiative Center opened in Oakland on a Thursday morning in October, a little more than a year after a rainy night on the 42nd floor of the Aurelian Spire. The building had been a disused community annex, retrofitted over 8 months into something functional, and considered a childcare space on the ground floor designed for overnight hours, a vocational training room with actual equipment, a consultation area where families worked through medical debt with legal advocates who were paid to stay until the problem was solved. The exterior was clean but not showy. The sign above the entrance was the same size as the signs on the neighboring buildings. Nothing about it announced itself as a monument. Deshawn stood at the front of the small outdoor gathering in a jacket he had bought for the occasion, charcoal gray, well-fitted, and the same boots he had been wearing the night Evelyn placed that gold watch on the table. He hadn't replaced them, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't see the point in pretending he'd come from somewhere other than where he'd come from. He spoke without notes. He talked about the specific exhaustion of working past midnight and still needing to be present for a child in the morning. He talked about the invisible infrastructure of people who kept every city running while the city slept, and how little that infrastructure had ever been designed to support them in return. He didn't mention Evelyn by name, though she was sitting in the third row with her hands folded in her lap. He just talked about what the center was built to do and what it would take to keep it doing it, in the plain-spoken language of someone who had been thinking about the problem for a long time. When he finished, Maya walked up beside him in a red coat carrying one end of a ribbon that a volunteer held taut from the other side. She looked out at the small crowd with the focused seriousness of a child who had been told this was important and had decided to take that seriously. She found her father's eyes. He nodded. She cut the ribbon with a pair of scissors that were slightly too large for her hands, and the gathered crowd responded with the kind of applause that meant something. Evelyn sat in the third row and watched, and something in her expression had the quality of a person who has spent a long time being certain about things and has recently become less certain and has decided after consideration that this is an improvement. A journalist from a local outlet found her after the ceremony while people were moving inside for coffee and a tour of the space. He asked what she had learned from the night at Skyglass Meridian that led her here. Evelyn thought about it for a moment. That was genuine rather than staged. "I thought I was testing whether he could survive 2 minutes in my world," she said. "What I found out is that my world couldn't survive 2 minutes of honest contact with his. The room didn't know what to do with someone who wasn't performing anything. Neither did I." She looked toward the entrance where Deshawn was holding the door open for a family with 2 young children who had come to see what the center was. "He didn't stay to prove something to me. I just happened to be in the room where he was proving something to himself. There's a difference." Later, after the crowd had thinned and the coffee had gone cold, Deshawn walked Maya along the front of the building, her hand in his, both of them looking up at the sign with the unhurried attention of 2 people who had earned the right to stand in front of it. "Daddy," Maya said, still reading the sign, "do you remember the night you stayed out all night?" "I remember," he said. She considered this. "Was it scary?" He looked down at her, the red coat, the slightly too serious expression she wore when she was thinking something through. "No," he said. "It was just a long night. I've had longer." Maya seemed to accept this. She tightened her hand in his and pulled him toward the entrance. "I want to see the sleeping room," she said. "I know," he said. "Come on." They walked through the door together and the lights inside were on, and they stayed on because that was the whole point. Some people walk into a room and try to own it. Others walk in and remind everyone what the room was always supposed to be for. Deshawn Carter didn't fight for respect that night. He simply refused to leave without it. And that quiet refusal changed everything. If this story reminded you that dignity doesn't come with a price tag, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories about the people who stay in the room when the world expects them to walk out, subscribe. There are more of them. There always have been.